February 16th, 1892. The New York Times runs a list of names. 319, not 400. The man behind it had spent years, actual years, insisting that exactly 400 people mattered in fashionable New York. When he finally committed to paper, he came up 81 short. Could not even fill his own roster. Ward McAllister, Southerner, no real fortune of his own, never built a thing you could photograph. What he had, for about 20 years, was the power to decide who got through the door, the right door. The only door, if you were a certain kind of person in Gilded Age Manhattan. An invitation managed by McAllister meant you existed. The absence of one meant, socially speaking, you did not. The list blew up. People on it were furious. Who asked to be named? People left off were worse. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco reprinted the thing, tore it apart, made jokes. Someone pointed out that the roster was suspiciously packed with bankers and Civil War profiteers. So much for ancient bloodlines. Here is why McAllister is worth an hour of your time. He did not climb the social ladder. He built one, charged admission. Then, in a move so spectacularly stupid it almost looks deliberate, he published the blueprints, exposed the whole machinery. The people at the top never forgave him. 3 years after that list, he was dead, eating dinner alone at the Union Club, no company, no friends at the table. Mrs. Caroline Astor, the woman he had served and protected and flattered for 2 decades, the woman he called his mystic Rose. She skipped the funeral, had a dinner party. One of the patriarchs, the exclusive social club McAllister had founded and run for most of his adult life, got asked about him afterward. 5 words. McAllister is a discharged servant. New York, after the Civil War, was drowning in new money. That was the problem. Not poverty, not crime. Money. Specifically, too many people who had it, and not enough agreement about what it entitled them to. War contracts had done it. Uniforms, weapons, canned food, railroad transport. Men who had been comfortable before 1861 were filthy rich by 1865. Bond speculators, meat packers, steel men, oil men. They poured into Manhattan and expected the welcome mat. They got the opposite. Old New York, the Knickerbockers they called themselves, had run the city's social machinery since the Dutch were still in charge. Schermerhorns, Livingstons, Van Rensselaers, families that had been on Manhattan longer than the English language had. They operated on a simple principle. Money alone? Insufficient. What mattered was where the money came from and how many generations had sat on it. Breeding, manners. Whether you knew your way around a 12-course dinner without embarrassing yourself. Unwritten rules, every single one of them. And that was exactly the problem. Nothing codified, nothing enforceable. Just a vague consensus among people who had always been in the room that they could recognize their own kind. London had the Queen to settle these questions. Paris had an aristocracy that kept coming back, no matter how many revolutions tried to kill it. New York had nothing. A vacuum. Rich people who all believed they belonged at the top, arguing about who actually did. The opera was where it got ugly. Academy of Music, 14th Street, opened 1854. Old Money's fortress. 18 private boxes, every last one locked down by Knickerbocker families who would sooner burn the building than share. The Vanderbilts wanted a box. Vanderbilts, richer than half the royal families in Europe at that point. Turned down. Money too new. Try again never. So Cornelius and his sons built the Metropolitan Opera, 20 blocks north, 3 times the boxes, better sound, better sightlines. And suddenly the Academy looked like what it was, a small, aging theatre, clinging to a distinction nobody under 40 cared about anymore. Within a few seasons, finished. The Knickerbocker families migrated uptown quietly, which is how old money always surrenders, without admitting it happened. What gets me about this whole era, and I keep coming back to it, is the gap between what America said about itself and what was actually going on in the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue. All men created equal. Sure. Meanwhile, the 1880s are consumed by a vicious, expensive, genuinely petty war over who sits in which box at which opera house. Nobody's life was at stake. No legislation hung in the balance. Pure status. And status in Gilded Age New York worked like a currency with no central bank. Everybody spent it. Nobody controlled the supply. That vacuum, that is why Ward McAllister had a career at all. No money to compete with the Vanderbilts, no bloodline to match the Schermerhorns. What he brought back from 3 years studying the way European aristocrats ran their dinner tables was a system. A complete operating manual for how exclusion should work. The city was desperate for someone to impose order. Nobody asked him. He just showed up and started doing it. Most people who end up running things were born close to the top. McAllister was not. He was born close enough to see it. That is a different thing entirely. Savannah, Georgia, December 1827. His father, Matthew Hall McAllister, was a judge, respected, connected. The family had standing in Southern society, which meant they got invited to the right dinners and knew the right people. What they did not have was serious wealth. Not Astor wealth. Not even second-tier New York wealth. In a port city full of cotton money, comfortable was another word for forgettable. His mother's side gave him something more useful than status. Through her, he was a first cousin of Julia Ward Howe, who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic. More importantly, Julia's late husband, Samuel Ward, had been married to Emily Astor, granddaughter of John Jacob Astor himself. The connection was distant. It was also real. In the world Ward intended to enter, a thread like that could open rooms that money alone could not. In 1850, he and his father went to California. Gold rush. But the McAllisters did not go to dig. They went to litigate. Men pulling nuggets out of riverbeds needed lawyers when they fought over claims, and they fought constantly. Ward joined his father's firm, McAllister and Sons, and within 2 years had made enough money to quit law forever. 24 years old, done with work. Not because he was lazy, because he had figured out what he actually wanted to do with his life. He wanted to be the person who decided how rich people should behave. I realize how absurd that sounds. It sounded absurd at the time, too. His father expected a legal career. Ward looked at that and thought, no, I am going to become an expert in seating arrangements and the correct way to address a duchess. 1853. He married Sarah Tainter Gibbons. This matters, and not because it was a love story. Sarah's father was a Georgia millionaire. Her grandfather was Thomas Gibbons, the man behind Gibbons versus Ogden, 1824. One of the most important commerce cases in American history, and Thomas Gibbons had employed a young ferryman named Cornelius Vanderbilt as his captain during that fight, mentored him, gave him his start. The Vanderbilt empire began, in a sense, with the Gibbons family. Ward married into that. Sarah brought the fortune. Ward brought the ambition. Right after the wedding, he bought a farm on Narragansett Bay, planted some trees, then left the country. 3 years in Europe. London first. Paris for the Universal Exposition of 1855. The baptism of the French imperial prince in 1856. Winters in Florence, on the Arno. Then Pau in the French Pyrenees, where wealthy Europeans went to be seen escaping the cold. Bath, Bad Nauheim, the whole circuit. He was not studying art or architecture. He was studying how the upper classes ran their social lives, the mechanics of a formal ball, which wines in which order, how a hostess managed a table of 30. The thing he grasped, the thing most Americans missed, was that European aristocracy ran on ritual, not wealth. The money was assumed. What separated people within the wealthy class was knowledge of form, the right greeting, the right sequence of courses. These were skills. They could be learned. And the person who mastered them could become indispensable to people who had more money but less polish. He came back to New York on October 15th, 1858, 30 years old. No profession, no interest in getting one. He had a system, borrowed from every court and country house he had visited, adapted for a country that had no aristocracy of its own. He also had his wife's money. Their house was modest, but McAllister understood something most social climbers get wrong. You do not need to be the richest person in the room. You need to be the person the richest person in the room cannot do without. That person had not yet arrived. Caroline Astor was still a young wife on Fifth Avenue, managing a household, waiting for something she did not yet know she needed. McAllister had not met her, but everything he had spent the last decade preparing for was building toward that meeting. The way McAllister told it later, he knew immediately. One meeting with Caroline Astor, sometime in the early 1870s, and he understood what he was looking at. A woman with the Schermerhorn bloodline, the Astor fortune, and a husband who spent most of his time on a yacht called the Noormahal. William Backhouse Astor Jr. had almost no interest in social life. He was at sea for months at a stretch. That left Caroline alone with the calendar, the guest lists, and a position she had not yet figured out how to weaponize. McAllister had the weapon. He just needed someone willing to use it. Their arrangement was not a friendship. He was the architect. She was the client who also happened to be the building. Without her name and her ballroom, everything he had learned in Europe was theory. Without his knowledge of how a functioning aristocracy operated, she was just another rich woman hosting parties. Together, they were something else. The first move was the Patriarchs, 1872. McAllister gathered 25 men from the oldest families in New York. Van Rensselaers, Gullets, Livingstons, Schermerhorns naturally. He made them into a committee and assigned them one job: throw the best ball of the season, every season. The trick was the invitation structure. Each patriarch could invite 4 ladies and 5 gentlemen of his choosing. No appeals, no negotiation, no buying your way in. If none of the 25 men selected you, you did not attend. And if you did not attend the patriarch's ball repeatedly, you were, by the logic McAllister had constructed, nobody. The first ball was held at Delmonico's. The press covered it like a state dinner. Within 2 seasons, a patriarch's invitation had become the single most valuable piece of paper in New York social life. Not a stock certificate, not a deed. A card telling you that you were welcome at a party at a restaurant, that this carried genuine weight, that adults with fortunes in the tens of millions organized their calendars around it, tells you something about Gilded Age New York that no economic history ever captures. McAllister managed every detail personally. Caroline presided. She did not touch logistics. Her function was simpler and more powerful. She showed up. When Caroline Astor showed up, the event was legitimate. When she did not, it was just a party. He called her the Mystic Rose, borrowing from Dante, the figure in Paradiso around whom all of heaven revolves. Excessive, even for the era. Also accurate. What most people did not fully appreciate was that McAllister had no independent power. Zero. Take away Caroline, and he was a short, fussy man from Georgia with opinions about wine that nobody had to listen to. Every invitation he controlled, every family he admitted or denied, all of it derived from her. He was the most powerful man in New York society, and he existed entirely at her pleasure. She never replaced him, not for almost 20 years. Whether that was loyalty, convenience, or something harder to name is a question McAllister probably never let himself ask. He divided the world into knobs and swells, old money and new. The knobs were the foundation. The swells were the ones he considered worth admitting, case by case. Not all new money, selected new money, the ones who dressed correctly and showed the right deference. This sorting function was his real job, not organizing parties, deciding who deserved to come to them. The swells he let in were grateful. The ones he kept out were furious. Both reactions increased his power. For roughly 2 decades this held. McAllister at the gate, Caroline behind him, the patriarch's ball at Delmonico's, Newport in the summer, a complete, self-reinforcing aristocracy built from scratch in a country that was never supposed to have one. It held because nobody tested it seriously. Then the Vanderbilts showed up with more money than God and a woman named Alva who had no intention of waiting to be invited. Alva Smith married William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1875 and spent the next 8 years planning a single evening. That is not an exaggeration. Everything she did between the wedding and March of 1883 was preparation. She was from Mobile, Alabama. Old Southern family. No real money left after the war. She had spent part of her childhood in France, spoke the language fluently, and possessed a quality that her contemporaries described with words like forceful and determined, which were polite ways of saying she terrified most of the people she met. William K. was Cornelius Vanderbilt's grandson, heir to a railroad fortune that dwarfed anything the Knickerbockers controlled. What the Vanderbilts could not get, despite all of it, was past Caroline Astor's door. Alva decided that the door was the problem, so she built her own. 660 Fifth Avenue, a full city block between 51st and 52nd Streets. Richard Morris Hunt designed it. French Gothic, limestone. The thing looked like it had been airlifted out of the Loire Valley and dropped onto Manhattan. Construction took years and cost approximately $3 million, which in today's money is somewhere around $100 million. New York had never seen a private residence like it. That was the point. When the house was finished, Alva announced a costume ball. Guest list of 1,200. The most ambitious private entertainment the city had ever attempted. And she knew exactly who she needed in that room to make it matter. Here is where it gets good. Caroline Astor's youngest daughter, Carrie, had been rehearsing a quadrille with friends for weeks. Group dance, elaborate costumes. One of the planned highlights of the evening. Invitations arrived for every girl in the group, except Carrie. Alva's explanation, when it was sought, was surgical. She could not possibly invite Miss Astor. Mrs. Astor had never called upon her at her new home. Until that call was made, no social relationship existed between the two households. Therefore, no invitation could be extended. Think about what she did there. She took Caroline's own system, the calling card ritual that McAllister and Caroline had spent 15 years enforcing as the foundation of social order, and turned it into a weapon aimed directly at Caroline's daughter. You made these rules. Now live with them. Caroline folded. She left her calling card at 660 Fifth Avenue. The invitation arrived the same day. Some sources say within hours, March 26th, 1883. Carriages from 10 in the evening. Police deployed for crowd control outside. 1,200 guests in costumes that had consumed months of planning. Alva dressed as a Venetian princess. Her sister-in-law Alice Vanderbilt wore white satin wired for electric current, studded with glass beads in a lightning pattern. Battery hidden in the dress. The press called it the electric light costume. A photographer named Jose Maria Mora documented the evening, and his portraits survive as the only known photographs taken inside a Gilded Age costume ball. Champagne alone cost $65,000. The total bill ran to roughly $250,000, equivalent to something like $8 million today. The dancing went until sunrise. Ward McAllister was there. Caroline Astor was there. By the time the last carriage pulled away from Fifth Avenue, the Vanderbilts were inside. Not because anyone had decided they belonged, because Alva had made it impossible to pretend they did not. What fascinates me about this whole episode is not the money or the spectacle. It is the precision. Alva did not bribe her way in. She did not throw a bigger party and hope for the best. She studied the exact mechanism by which Caroline Astor maintained power, identified its single structural weakness, and exploited it through her opponent's own daughter. That is not socializing. That is siege warfare conducted with calling cards. The Vanderbilts received their invitation to the Astor Ball the following January. The matter was settled, and the boundary Caroline had maintained for over a decade, the line between old money and new, had been crossed permanently, not by force, by someone who had learned the rules better than the woman who made them. Newport, Rhode Island, was not McAllister's invention. Rich Southerners had been going there to escape the heat since before the Civil War. His own family summered there when he was a boy. But what Newport became in the 1870s and 80s, the place where social position was performed outdoors for an entire season, that was his. He got there first, before the Astors, before the Vanderbilts, before the cottages that cost more than most European palaces. McAllister arrived in Newport when it was still a quiet coastal town with a few boarding houses and some old money families who kept to themselves. He saw what it could be, a stage, smaller than New York, more intimate, easier to control. His method was the picnic. That sounds ridiculous, and it sort of was. But McAllister turned outdoor entertaining at Newport into an art form with real social consequences. He organized elaborate fêtes champêtres on the lawns of estates along Bellevue Avenue, multi-course meals served on linen in the open air, orchestras, carefully managed guest lists, the same filtering system he would later build into the Patriarch's Ball. Except here the setting was a field, and the dress code was slightly less formal. Slightly. The genius of Newport, from McAllister's perspective, was that it compressed everything. In New York, you could avoid someone for months. Manhattan was large enough to maintain distance. Newport was a few streets. Bellevue Avenue, Ocean Drive, Bailey's Beach, where acceptable families bathed, the casino, where the approved circle gathered in the afternoons. You saw everyone every day, which meant that who spoke to whom, who sat with whom, who received an invitation and who did not, all of it was visible immediately. There was no hiding in Newport. If you were out, everyone knew by lunch. McAllister used this. He made Newport into a laboratory for the social order he was building in New York. Test the rules in a smaller environment over the summer. Apply them at scale in Manhattan when the season started. Caroline Astor followed him there. She and William Backhouse purchased Beechwood on Bellevue Avenue in 1880 for just under $200,000. An Italianate villa built for a clothing merchant named Daniel Parrish. Adequate, which was not a word Caroline operated in. Between 1888 and 1890, She had Richard Morris Hunt renovate the place at a cost of $2 million. He enlarged the dining room to seat 200, added a music room, built a loggia facing the cliff walk, and added a ballroom, capacity 400. That number again. Beechwood became the summer version of 34th Street. Caroline received, Caroline assessed, Caroline decided. The rhythms were different. Afternoons on the water, carriage processions along Bellevue Avenue, dinner parties that started late and ran later. But the calculus underneath was identical. In 1892, Alva built Marble House on Bellevue Avenue, close enough to Beechwood that the comparison could not be avoided. Hunt drew the plans. Caroline's own architect. $11 million, 500,000 cubic feet of marble. A ballroom finished in gilded bronze. The building made Beechwood look like a farmhouse. Alva had already forced Caroline's hand in New York with the costume ball 9 years earlier. In Newport, she used the same instrument. If you cannot get past someone's social barriers, build something so large and so expensive that the barriers stop mattering. Caroline did not renovate in response. There was no point competing with Marble House on those terms. What Beechwood had was continuity. It had been the center of Newport before Marble House existed. Caroline's position rested on something a newer building could not simply purchase. At least not yet. But McAllister could feel it shifting. Newport was getting louder, richer. The cottages being built in the 1890s dwarfed anything the previous generation had imagined. The quiet exclusivity he had cultivated was dissolving. New money did not want privacy. New money wanted to be seen. Alva Vanderbilt had walked through the walls twice now. She would not be the last. He did not mean to say it. Or maybe he did. With McAllister, the line between calculation and carelessness was never entirely clear. March 24th, 1888. A reporter from the New York Tribune sat down with McAllister. Routine interview, society coverage. The kind of thing McAllister had done dozens of times without consequence. Except this time the reporter pressed him on something specific. How many people actually mattered in New York? Not roughly, not approximately. How many? There are only about 400 people in fashionable New York society. If you go outside that number, you strike people who are either not at ease in a ballroom or else make other people not at ease. The reporter printed the number. By morning, the 400 existed as a concept, not just a guest list, a phrase. McAllister had given a name to something the entire city had been arguing about for a decade, and the name stuck instantly because it did what all good labels do. It simplified a complicated reality into something small enough to fight about. Then someone noticed the math. 400 was, roughly, the capacity of Caroline Astor's ballroom on 34th Street. McAllister admitted this when asked, whether the number was genuine social calculus or just the size of a room. He never quite settled the question, probably because the ambiguity was useful. For 4 years after the Tribune interview, he refused to publish actual names. 4 years of that. Everyone who believed they belonged spent 4 years wondering if they were on a list they could not see. Everyone who suspected they did not belong spent 4 years dreading confirmation. McAllister had created a currency backed by nothing but suspense. And he milked it with a showman's instinct that nobody had previously given him credit for. He gave interviews, dropped hints, let newspapers speculate. The press loved him for it, because he was an endless source of copy. When McAllister was rumored to be aboard a transcontinental train, one account claims, grizzled cowboys and plainsmen galloped miles just to catch a glimpse of him, a society gossip from New York, in the middle of Wyoming. The 400 had made him that famous. The phrase entered American culture like a virus. Music halls wrote songs about it. Puck and Judge ran cartoons almost weekly. O. Henry would later title an entire book, The 4 Million, as a direct rebuke. His way of saying every person in New York was worth paying attention to, not just McAllister's chosen circle. The term became shorthand in any context where someone wanted to identify an elite group. Most people who use it today have no idea where it came from. Then he published the list. We covered this in the opening of the documentary, February 1892. 319 names in the New York Times, not 400. Spouses omitted, some names misspelled. At least one person on the list had been dead for years. The document that was supposed to be the definitive registry of American social aristocracy read, on close inspection, like it had been assembled in a hurry by a man reaching for something that was already slipping away. What the introduction did not cover is what happened inside the rooms where these people actually lived. The families who appeared on the list did not thank McAllister. They were appalled. Being named publicly in a newspaper as a member of a social elite was, by the standards of 1892 old money, vulgar. The system drew its power from what remained unsaid. You knew whether you belonged. The people who decided knew. Everyone else could speculate, but never confirm. McAllister had just torn that open and waved it in front of the whole country. The families who did not appear had it worse. Being omitted was a public verdict, not quiet exclusion, which could have been managed privately, but a printed, nationally circulated statement that Ward McAllister did not consider them worthy. Standing in this world operated as the primary currency for a certain class of Americans. The list hit like a bank run, and the list itself was a mess. Historians who have examined it note that it was heavy with bankers, lawyers, brokers, and railroad men who had made their fortunes during or after the Civil War. Not exactly the ancient Dutch bloodlines McAllister claimed to be protecting. His own Southern allies were well represented. So were several families whose primary qualification appeared to be that they had been nice to McAllister personally. Less a map of aristocracy than a record of one man's social debts, printed in the newspaper of record. What separates this from a calculated move is simpler than it looks. McAllister was genuinely surprised. He had spent 2 decades as the gatekeeper and had come to believe, somewhere along the way, that the gate belonged to him. It did not. It belonged to the people behind it. And they had just watched their gatekeeper hand the key to a reporter. The book came before the list. That matters. Society as I Have Found It was published in 1890, 2 years before McAllister put the 400 in the New York Times. So when he handed that list to the press in February of 1892, he was already damaged. The book had started the fire. The list just made sure everyone could see the smoke. Why did he write it? The obvious answer is vanity. McAllister had always loved attention, but vanity alone does not explain the timing. Something had changed by 1890, and it was not in his favor. Mamie Fish, wife of Stuyvesant Fish, the railroad financier, younger than Caroline Astor by a generation. She had started throwing parties in the late 1880s that followed no rules McAllister recognized. She shortened formal dinners from 2 hours to under an hour because she found them boring. She invited performers. She invited people who were interesting rather than people who were appropriate. At one dinner, she introduced the guest of honor, who turned out to be a chimpanzee in evening dress. The newspapers could not get enough of her. McAllister despised everything about this. It violated the system he had spent 20 years constructing. Worse, Mamie Fish had started excluding him from her events. Not publicly, not with any announcement. She simply stopped inviting him. In the language of Gilded Age New York, that was a declaration of war. Harry Lehr was part of it. Younger, flashier, willing to play the jester in ways McAllister considered beneath his dignity. Lehr was positioning himself as the new social organizer, the man hostesses called when they wanted an evening managed. He would eventually marry for money, reportedly telling his wife on their wedding night that he did not love her, but would treat her with public affection. That is the kind of person who was replacing Ward McAllister. The game was getting meaner and he was getting older. So he wrote the book, 400 pages of memoirs. And here is where the desperation shows, because the book is not what you would expect from a man trying to reassert his authority. It reads like a plea. McAllister name drops on nearly every page: the Van Burens, the Morgans, the Livingstons, the Astors. He describes private dinners. He catalogues who wore what and who sat where and which wines were served in which order. He recounts conversations that the other participants almost certainly considered confidential. He lays out the mechanics of how patriarchs' balls were organized, how invitations were selected, how the entire sorting process worked. Everything that derived its power from being unspoken, he spoke. A man, secure in his position, does not do this. A man who knows the room still belongs to him does not sit down and write a manual explaining how the room works. The book reads, with a century of distance, like the work of someone who could feel the floor shifting and decided that if he could not hold the room, he would at least make sure everyone knew he had built it. Old New York was not impressed. The families he named were mortified, not because the stories were false, because they were true. McAllister had spent 2 decades inside their homes, at their tables, managing their most private social rituals. They had trusted him with access. He had turned that access into content. Town Topics, the gossip magazine that had once treated McAllister as a reliable source, started calling him Mr. McHustler. The name stuck. The Patriarch's ball that season was poorly attended. Even Caroline Astor found a reason to skip it. That detail is worth pausing on. She had been the anchor of every social event McAllister had organized for nearly 20 years. Her absence from a patriarch's ball was not a scheduling conflict. It was a signal. One biographer noted that McAllister wrote the book because Mamie Fisher's exclusion of him felt like the beginning of the end, and the book was his attempt to prove he was still indispensable. Instead, it proved the opposite. It proved he was the kind of man who, when he felt his grip loosening, would sell out the people who had made him rather than accept the loss quietly. What nobody at the time fully grasped, and what McAllister certainly did not grasp, was that the book and the list, together, had done something irreversible. Not to his reputation, to the system itself. The social machinery he and Caroline had built depended on judgment. Personal, private, case-by-case judgment, exercised behind closed doors by people who never explained their decisions. McAllister had replaced that with print, a book anyone could buy, a list anyone could read. He had democratized the one thing in New York that was never supposed to be democratic. The irony is perfect, and he missed it completely. The Gatekeeper had published the gate's blueprints, the combination to the lock, and a detailed map of everything behind the wall. Then he wondered why nobody wanted him guarding the entrance anymore. April 9th, 1893. The New York World publishes an interview. Ward McAllister has opinions about Chicago. He has never been to Chicago. That did not stop him. The World's Columbian Exposition was weeks from opening. 27 million visitors expected, the largest event ever staged in the Western Hemisphere. Chicago had beaten New York for the right to host it, which still burned in certain Manhattan circles, and the city was spending millions to prove it deserved the honor. new buildings designed by Daniel Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted, a fairground that covered 630 acres along the lakefront. The White City, they called it. A statement to the world that Chicago was not a pork-packing outpost. It was a real city, a serious city. McAllister read about all of this from his usual position, a dining table in New York. The interview in The World was presented as helpful advice. McAllister offered guidance to Chicago's hostesses on how to properly entertain the New York elite when they arrived for the fair. Hire French chefs. Do not frappier your wine too much. Understand that New York society is 15 years ahead of Chicago's. But do not be discouraged, because with effort and proper guidance, the gap could be narrowed. He also said this: the contact of New York and Chicago society during the World's Fair cannot help but open the eyes of our Western natives to our superiority. Western natives. Chicago lost its mind. The Inter-Ocean called him an ass. Not in an editorial buried on page 6, on the front page. The Chicago Times asked him what hospitality even meant and suggested he consult the Bedouins for a definition. The Chicago Evening Journal ran a soap advertisement mocking his advice about wine. A Helena, Montana newspaper recommended that McAllister be packed in ice up to his neck. Papers from Cincinnati to Los Angeles picked up the story. Religious wars and race wars have a reputation for ferociousness, wrote the Cincinnati Post, but they do not compare with a society war such as is just now being waged between the snobocracy of New York and the nabobbery of Chicago. Snobocracy of New York. Nabobbery of Chicago. 1893 had better insults than we do. McAllister responded with a follow-up interview a week later. He tried to walk it back. He had not meant to insult Chicago. He had personal knowledge that the society women of Chicago were well-dressed and cultivated. He had never called it a pork-packing town. The damage was done. The follow-up managed to offend Chicago a second time while also making him look weak. The Chicago Evening Journal noted that his knowledge of what he was talking about was not in any degree commensurate with the interest he appeared to take in it. The newly elected mayor of Chicago, Carter Harrison, handled the whole affair with the calm of a man who knew he was winning. He would chill his wine however he pleased. What makes this episode matter, beyond the comedy, is the timing. McAllister had published the book in 1890, published the list in 1892, been mocked by Town Topics, been quietly dropped by Caroline Astor, been replaced at parties by Harry Lehr. The Chicago disaster came in April of 1893. Every public move he made was now making things worse. A man who had built his career on knowing exactly the right thing to say in every social situation had lost the ability to read a room, or a city, or an entire region of the country. The fair opened May 1st. McAllister's tone suddenly reversed. He praised the architecture. He praised the exhibits. He praised Chicago. The Chicago Tribune noted that his ideas were apparently not bounded by the narrow circle which embraces terrapin, wine frappés, and the dress ball attended only by members of the 400. He reportedly attended the fair that summer. Whether anyone in Chicago was glad to see him is not recorded. The Columbian Exposition ran for 6 months, drew 27 million visitors, and reshaped American architecture, urban planning, and national identity. It was the event of the decade. Carter Harrison, the mayor who had brushed off McAllister's advice with a shrug, was assassinated at his home on October 28th, just days before the fair closed. The closing ceremonies were cancelled. Chicago mourned a man who had actually done something. McAllister, back in New York, had 16 months left to live. The city he had insulted would forget him long before it forgot its mayor. By 1894, The list of people willing to be seen with Ward McAllister had grown shorter than anything he had ever published in the Times. The patriarchs had removed him from his organizing duties. No confrontation, no public scene. They simply stopped consulting him. Fish's assessment was 5 words: a discharged servant. That was all McAllister amounted to, from a man who controlled a railroad empire, directed at a man who controlled nothing. Town Topics kept the nickname going, Mr. McHustler. The magazine that had once printed his pronouncements as social gospel now treated him as content of a different kind. Puck and Judge still ran cartoons, but the tone had shifted. He was no longer being satirized as a powerful man with absurd habits. He was being satirized as an irrelevant one. Caroline Astor had not formally severed ties. She did not operate that way. The consultations simply stopped. The conversations that had been the substance of their partnership for 2 decades went quiet. McAllister still attended some events. He was not barred from society in the absolute sense. He was something worse, tolerated. Harry Lear had his job now. Mamie Fish had the energy of the new social world. Alva, who had divorced William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1895 and married Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, was operating entirely outside the old framework. She had pushed through the divorce against her lawyer's advice, won a $10 million settlement plus several properties, and then forced her daughter Consuelo into a marriage with the Duke of Marlborough to maintain her position. The wedding was so enormous, it allowed Alva to keep her standing despite the scandal. Within a year, several other women among the 400 had followed her lead and filed for divorce. Alva boasted about being a trailblazer. This was the world McAllister was living in and no longer shaping. The younger generation wanted spectacle, not protocol. The rules he had imported from European courts felt antique to people who had grown up wealthy enough to invent their own. Private ballrooms in the new uptown mansions eliminated the need for a shared venue like Delmonico's. The organizer role disappeared with it, and so did McAllister. He still dined at the Union Club, still went through the motions. But the motions were thinner now, fewer tables, fewer companions. He had once determined every significant seating chart in New York. Now he was eating alone more often than anyone around him wanted to acknowledge. January 31st, 1895. McAllister sat down for dinner at the Union Club. He was 67. He had been unwell for a short period, though the details are vague in the records. At some point during the meal, or shortly after, he died. Some say he collapsed at the table. Others say he finished eating and was found afterward. What every source agrees on is that he was alone. The funeral was held at Grace Church on February 5th. Cornelius Vanderbilt II served as a pallbearer. Remember who the Vanderbilts were in this story. The family McAllister had tried hardest to exclude. The family Alva had forced past his defences 12 years earlier, sent its patriarch to carry his coffin. Whatever grudge they might have held, they let it go at the church door. Or maybe carrying McAllister's coffin was its own kind of statement. Fewer than 20 members of the 400 attended. 5 patriarchs showed up, out of 25. Caroline Astor did not come. Her calendar that evening listed a dinner engagement. She kept it. Whether she chose the conflict deliberately or simply did not rearrange her schedule is a question nobody alive can answer. Both possibilities say something. Neither says anything good. 2 years later, in 1897, the Society of Patriarchs dissolved. Lack of interest. The organization McAllister had founded, the instrument through which he had controlled access to New York society for over 2 decades, ended not with a scandal or a vote, but with a shrug. Nobody cared enough to keep it going. He was buried at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. same ground as Boss Tweed and Leonard Bernstein and dozens of other New Yorkers whose fame outlasted their funerals. McAllister's grave does not attract visitors. No line, no plaque explaining who he was. Just a name on a stone in a cemetery full of names. The kind of anonymity he had built an entire career to avoid. The 400 died before the people on it did. Not all at once. There was no announcement, no repeal. But by the time the new century arrived, the phrase had already started to mean something different. It was becoming historical, a reference point for how things used to work, rather than a description of how they still did. The Social Register, that quietly published directory of acceptable families, had absorbed the function McAllister once performed in person. A book, updated annually. No dinners required, no patriarchs, no gatekeeper standing at the door deciding who deserved to pass. Just names on a page, printed and mailed to subscribers. McAllister would have hated it. The whole point, his whole point, was that social standing required human judgment, a personal eye, someone who could assess not just your name and your fortune, but how you carried yourself in a room, how you handled a conversation, whether you made the people around you comfortable or nervous. A printed list could not do that. It could only record outcomes. McAllister had been in the business of creating them. Caroline Astor outlived him by 13 years. She kept entertaining into the early 1900s. The mansion on 65th Street was larger and more imposing than the old brownstone on 34th Street. Her January ball still drew guests who understood what an invitation represented. But something had shifted that neither she nor anyone else could reverse. The people who came now came out of respect for what she had been, not because they feared what she could do. Her mind began to fail in her final years. The details were kept quiet, as old New York kept everything quiet. But servants at the 65th Street mansion reportedly set the table for dinner parties where the guests existed only in Caroline's memory. She received people who were not there. She spoke of friends who had been dead for years, as though they were expected any moment. The woman who had spent 4 decades deciding who belonged in the room could no longer tell who was actually in it. She died on October 30th, 1908, 78 years old. Heart failure. Her son Jack was at her bedside earlier that day. Her daughter Carrie was there at the end. 3.5 years later, Jack boarded the Titanic. He was the wealthiest passenger on the ship. He did not survive. The mansion was sold by her grandson, Vincent, in 1926 and demolished. The Waldorf Astoria, that monument to the family argument between Caroline and William Waldorf Astor, was torn down in 1929. The Empire State Building went up on the same ground, 102 floors of limestone and steel, on the spot where a woman once stood beneath her own portrait and decided who mattered. But this is a documentary about McAllister, not Caroline. And the question that matters is whether anything he built survived him. The honest answer is no, and also yes. No, because the system collapsed. The patriarchs dissolved. The 400 scattered. The rigid social hierarchy he had constructed, with its calling cards and its carefully managed guest lists and its 2-filter gatekeeping, did not outlast the generation that had submitted to it. Newport kept going as a summer destination for the wealthy, but the exclusive social court McAllister and Caroline had presided over was finished by 1900. The younger generation, the Mamie Fishes and the Alva Belmonts, wanted a world where energy and audacity counted for more than bloodline and protocol. They got it. Yes, because the idea survived. McAllister invented the concept of the social gatekeeper in America. Before him, New York's elite sorted itself loosely through family connections and informal consensus. After him, there was a model, a method. Someone stands at the door. Someone decides who gets in. Someone maintains the illusion that the boundary between inside and outside is natural rather than manufactured. Every velvet rope in every nightclub in every city in the world is a descendant of what Ward McAllister built at Delmonico's in 1872. He also gave the language, the 400. The phrase outlasted him, outlasted Caroline, outlasted the patriarchs and the Gilded Age, and every person who was ever on or off the list. It entered the American vocabulary and never left. People use it without knowing where it came from. Without knowing that it started as an offhand remark to a newspaper reporter by a man from Savannah who had married well and studied European dinner parties. The phrase was his monument, not a building, not a foundation, not a charitable trust with his name on the door, a phrase, which, when you think about what he actually did for a living, is probably the right kind of legacy for a man whose entire career was built on words, invitations, and the power of being included or left out. His grave at Greenwood has no line of visitors, no historical marker, no tour group stopping to explain that this is where the man who invented American high society is buried. The cemetery is beautiful, though. Rolling hills, old trees, views of the Manhattan skyline across the harbor. McAllister would have approved of the setting, if not the anonymity. He spent his life making sure certain people would be remembered and others forgotten. History returned the favor. Ward McAllister tried to build something that America was never supposed to have, a permanent aristocracy, not based on land or title or military service, based on manners, on knowing which wine to serve and when to stop talking, and how to enter a room without making the wrong people uncomfortable. It worked for about 20 years. Then he wrote it all down, and the whole thing fell apart. There is a temptation to treat him as a joke. The little man from Savannah, who appointed himself king of New York's drawing rooms and got thrown out when he stopped being useful. The press treated him that way in the end. Mr. McHustler, the discharged servant. A man mocked by cowboys in Wyoming and newspaper editors in Chicago, and, finally, by the very people he had spent his life trying to impress. But dismissing him misses what he actually accomplished. Before McAllister, American wealth had no social structure above it. Rich people competed with each other, displayed their money, built bigger houses, threw louder parties. There was no order to any of it, no hierarchy, no agreed-upon standard for what separated the people who belonged from the people who merely had money. McAllister, working with Caroline Astor, imposed one, imported it from European courts, adapted it for a country with no monarchy, and enforced it through ballrooms and guest lists and the quiet terror of not being invited. For a generation of Americans, that system was real. It determined marriages, it shaped careers, it decided which families rose and which ones spent decades on the outside looking in. Calling it trivial because it involved dinner parties and seating charts is like calling politics trivial because it involves handshakes and speeches. The mechanism looks silly. The consequences were not. He destroyed himself because he confused proximity to power with possession of it. That was his blind spot from the beginning. He stood next to Caroline Astor for 20 years and somewhere along the way started to believe that what the room saw when it looked at the two of them was a partnership of equals. It was not. She was the throne. He was the man who polished it. When he published the book and the list and the interviews, he was acting like someone who owned the operation. The owners disagreed. The speed of his fall says something about the nature of the power he held. Real power, the kind built on money or land or legal authority, takes time to dismantle. Social power can evaporate in a season. One book, one list, one badly timed interview about Chicago's wine, and the man who had controlled access to the most exclusive rooms in America was eating dinner alone. If you have enjoyed this documentary and want to see more stories about the families and figures who shaped American wealth and power, please like and subscribe. McAllister coined a phrase that outlived everything else he touched: the 400. Most Americans have heard it. Almost none of them know it started with a man from Georgia who married an heiress, studied European table manners for 3 years, and decided he was qualified to tell the richest people in the country how to behave. They listened. For a while. He is buried in Brooklyn. No visitors. No marker explaining what he did. Just a stone with a name on it in a cemetery where the Manhattan skyline is visible across the water. The city he tried to rule is right there. It does not look back.